At the reading of the will, my father's voice was as cold and clinical as the air conditioning in the lawyer's high-rise office. He didn't even look up from the mahogany table when he delivered the verdict. The penthouse and the Tesla were going to my brother, not to me. I didn't flinch. I didn't offer them the satisfaction of an argument or a tear. I simply folded my hands in my lap, settled my shoulders, and looked him straight in the eye with a gaze as calm and unmoving as a dead sea. "Keep it all," I said. The silence that followed was brittle. A few cousins in the back of the room shifted uncomfortably, their expensive silk suits rustling. Someone let out a short, confused titter of a laugh, the kind people make when they're not sure if they've just witnessed a breakdown or a bluff. My brother leaned back, a slow, honeyed smile spreading across his face. It wasn't a cruel expression, not exactly. It was worse. It was the look of a man who had finally received exactly what he felt the world owed him. To him, the universe had finally corrected its orbit. My father gave a single, curt nod, as if my lack of protest merely confirmed a disappointing truth he'd held about me for decades. "She understands," he said, his voice trailing off as he glanced toward the attorney. "She's always been the independent one." Independent. He threw the word around like a compliment, but we all knew what it really meant in this family. It was code for overlooked. It was a polite synonym for dismissed. I could feel the collective weight of every eye in that room pressing against me: extended family, neighbors, my father's business associates, and a few strangers whose presence here felt like an added insult. They were vultures waiting for a crack in my armor, a momentary lapse in my composure. They didn't realize that I had graduated from a school where holding still was a survival mechanism. They thought I had lost my mind. They had no idea I'd already won. My father adjusted his tie, that same small, precise motion he'd made my entire life whenever he felt he had successfully dominated a situation. He glanced at the document, then at the lawyer. "Well," he said, his tone almost conversational, "that should settle the matter." The attorney didn't respond immediately. He was an older man, mid-60s, with a frame so thin he looked as though he were made of parchment and wire. He flipped a page, his movements agonizingly slow. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the hushed room. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, his voice measured and professional. "There is an additional document your father, the late Thomas Whitaker, left behind." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but rather a slow creeping dread. My brother's smile faltered, the corners of his mouth twitching. My father's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" my father asked, his voice sharpening. The attorney adjusted his spectacles. "A separate directive. It was filed independently and carried a very specific instruction. It was to be read only after the primary will was settled." A heavy, suffocating silence descended. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence that comes when you realize the ground you're standing on is actually a trapdoor. I sat there, breathing steady, my heart a rhythmic thrum in my chest. Because I knew, or at least I suspected what was coming. For the first time that morning, I allowed myself to hear my grandfather's voice again. "You don't need their approval, Emily," he had told me years ago. "Just become someone they can no longer afford to ignore." I am 35 years old. I am a commissioned officer in the United States Navy. I've spent the better part of my adult life thousands of miles away from this town, this house, and this table. I've lived in cramped quarters, under gray skies, and in time zones they've never heard of. My brother stayed here. He built a business under our father's shadow, expanded it with our father's money, and made himself visible. He was present. He was understandable. I was an enigma. When I left for the military, my father didn't try to stop me. There were no arguments, no pleas to stay. "If that's what you want," he'd said, looking past me as if I were already gone. There was no pride in his voice, only a quiet acceptance, as if I had chosen a temporary hobby that would eventually fade. But it never did. My grandfather was the only one who ever asked why. He didn't ask it like a test. He asked because he genuinely wanted to see the world through my eyes. We used to sit on his back porch in the late afternoons, the humid air softening as the sun dipped behind the pines. He'd pour 2 glasses of iced tea, cloyingly sweet, exactly the way I hated it, yet I drank every drop. "You ever notice," he said once, "how people only respect what they can see with their own eyes?" I nodded, watching a bead of condensation roll down the glass. "They see your brother's office, his car, his balance sheets. That makes sense to them." He tapped the side of his glass. "But service? That's invisible. It doesn't show up in a bank statement." I remember looking at him then, trying to decipher if he was warning me about a life of obscurity or encouraging me to seek something deeper. "What if they never see it?" I asked. He smiled, a small, certain thing. "Then you make sure it was worth it anyway." The day I told the family I was enlisting, my brother laughed. He'd said. "You're actually serious?" My father didn't laugh. He just studied me like a math problem he couldn't be bothered to solve. "It's a hard life," he remarked. "You'll be gone most of the time." "I know." "It's your decision," he said, turning back to his window. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just stepping away from them. I had never really been standing in the same world they occupied. It was my grandfather who drove me to the recruiter's office. He was silent during the drive, his hands steady on the wheel of his old truck. When we arrived, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a watch. It was silver, scratched, and decidedly unluxurious. "This was mine," he said. "Wore it for 30 years. "I can't take that, Grandpa." He pressed it into my palm, his skin like old leather. "You're not taking it, Emily. You're carrying it." "Why me?" I asked, looking at the mechanical heartbeat of the watch. "Because you're the only one who understands the difference between price and value." Years passed. Deployments, promotions, and medals came and went. I missed the holidays and the birthdays. I sent money home sometimes, not because they needed it, but because it was a duty. No one ever thanked me. My father would spend our rare phone calls talking about my brother's new clients. About me, he would only say, "She's doing fine." Fine. A word that means everything and nothing. The last time I spoke to my grandfather, I was standing on a pier in Virginia, the wind cutting through my jacket. He sounded tired. "How are you holding up?" "I'm good, Grandpa. Just busy." "Busy is good," he chuckled. Then he whispered, "I'm proud of you, Emily." I closed my eyes, letting the salt air fill my lungs. "Thank you." I told myself I'd call him back in a few days. I didn't. By the time I had a moment of peace, he was gone. I didn't make it to his funeral because duty didn't allow it. That's the phrase the military uses to sanctify sacrifice. Now, I was back in this room, listening to the attorney open that second document. For the first time in my life, I saw my father look uncertain. "What is that?" my father asked, his voice losing its edge. The attorney didn't look up. "This is a separate directive filed by your father, Mr. Whitaker. It is to be read in full, without interruption." My brother tried to regain his footing, leaning back with a forced smirk. "Well, I guess Grandpa had one last thing to say. Probably left her his old truck." No one laughed. The lawyer began to read, and the words were like a series of controlled explosions. "This directive establishes a trust," the lawyer stated, "to be named the Whitaker Service Fund. Its purpose is to provide financial assistance to veterans and their families, specifically those who have served without recognition." My father's expression tightened. "A trust? With what funds?" The lawyer continued, his voice gaining strength. "The management and full discretionary control of this trust, including the entirety of Thomas Whitaker's private offshore holdings and land interests, shall be granted to my granddaughter, Emily Whitaker." Every head in the room snapped toward me. I didn't move. I felt the axis of the room tilt. "Wait," my brother stammered. "What do you mean full control?" "This decision," the attorney read, "is made with full confidence in her judgment, character, and understanding of service. Qualities I have observed consistently throughout her life." I closed my eyes. I could almost smell the sweet iced tea on that back porch. "Along with the trust," the lawyer added, "there is a personal letter to be read aloud." My father shifted. "This is unnecessary." The lawyer ignored him. "Emily, you chose a path that does not come with recognition. That is the nature of it. Your family may not understand what you have given, because they measure life differently. I am leaving you this responsibility not as a burden, but as an acknowledgement. You have already proven you can carry the weight of the world. What you deserve now is to be seen." The silence that followed was absolute. My brother looked as if he'd been slapped. So what? He spat. She gets a charity? The attorney looked at him over the rims of his glasses. She receives control of assets that significantly exceed the value of the primary estate, Mr. Whitaker. How significant? My father asked, his voice a ghost of itself. Enough to matter. I looked down at the old watch on my wrist. It was still ticking. Steady. Unwavering. I hadn't just inherited a fortune. I had been given a mission. As the meeting broke up, the room felt smaller. Relatives who had ignored me 10 minutes ago now hovered, their smiles oily and anxious. I ignored them all. I walked out onto the front steps of the house that had never felt like mine. My brother followed me out, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. You knew, he accused. I didn't. Then why aren't you surprised? I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the smallness he had spent his life trying to hide with Teslas and penthouses. I've spent 15 years being invisible, Julian. This doesn't change who I am. It only changes what you see. I didn't go back to the house that night. I didn't need the mahogany or the ghosts. I checked into a nondescript hotel by the highway. I sat on the edge of the bed, opened my bag, and took out the letter. What matters is that you continue anyway, it said. I looked at the field across the road, the shadows stretching long under the moonlight. The world was the same, yet everything was different. I wasn't just a soldier anymore. I was the keeper of a legacy they weren't even brave enough to imagine. It was the same nondescript roadside motel I had tethered myself to a dozen times over the years, a transient anchor for whenever visits home felt less like a return and more like an intrusion. Some things in this town were stubbornly stagnant, resistant to the passage of time. Tonight, that stagnation felt like a mercy. It was a relief to be somewhere that asked nothing of me. I dropped my duffel bag onto the vinyl-seated chair by the window, the heavy thud echoing in the small space. The room carried that universal motel scent, a sterile cocktail of industrial detergent and the metallic tang of an aging air conditioner struggling against the humidity. Outside, the sky was hemorrhaging its vibrant colors, bruising into that soft, melancholic gray-blue that lingers just before the night finally claims the horizon. For a long time, I just sat on the edge of the mattress, still encased in my uniform. My hands rested heavily on my knees, the fabric rough beneath my palms. The silence in the room wasn't oppressive, it was honest. In the military, you develop a peculiar relationship with silence. It isn't just the absence of noise, it's the absence of distraction. It's a discipline. You learn to sit within the cathedral of your own mind without looking for the exit. You learn not to flinch when your thoughts finally catch up to you. Eventually, the noise of the world filters out, and you're left with the only things that actually matter. That night, a single memory rose to the surface, refusing to be submerged. It wasn't about the legal complexities of the trust or the cold ink of the will. It was a fragment of a conversation with my father from years ago, a sentence I had buried deep under layers of resentment. You don't need anything from us. At the time, those words had felt like a clinical dismissal. I had taken them as a quiet way of being told I wasn't a brick in the empire they were building, that there was no room for me in their blueprints. But sitting there in the dim motel light, the truth shifted. He hadn't been trying to exile me. He had simply recognized that I existed on a different plane, somewhere he didn't have the map for, a place he didn't know how to reach. The next morning, the sun hadn't even cleared the trees when I woke. Old habits don't fade just because you've changed out of your boots. I dressed in civilian clothes, checked out with a silent nod to the clerk, and drove back toward the heart of town. I didn't head for the family estate with its manicured hedges and tall gates. Instead, I drove to the one place that had always served as my true north, my grandfather's house. It looked smaller than it did in my memories, or perhaps I was simply seeing it with eyes that had seen too much of the world. The white paint was flaking like dry skin along the edges of the porch, and the railing still leaned at that same precarious angle I remembered from childhood. Yet, the yard remained impeccable. Someone had been tending to the grass, keeping the weeds at bay. I parked on the gravel shoulder and climbed the steps. They groaned in the exact same spots they always had. I noticed that. I always noticed the structural weaknesses, the tells, the small shifts in the environment. It was how I stayed alive. The front door was locked tight. Of course it was. I didn't reach for the handle. I just stood there, staring at the weathered wood, letting the memories wash over me. He used to leave it wide open during the day, a standing invitation to the world. "There's no reason to keep people out if you aren't afraid of what you're guarding inside," he'd say. I never knew if that was profound wisdom or just the reckless bravado of a man who had already survived his worst days. Maybe it was both. I walked around to the back, where the screened-in porch overlooked the meadow. The 2 wicker chairs were still there, flanking the same small, circular table. One chair had a slight, permanent tilt, the one he had claimed as his own for decades. I stepped onto the boards, the wood creaking under my weight, and sat down. For a fleeting second, the air felt still, as if the last 10 years had been nothing but a fever dream. "I figured you'd eventually find your way here." The voice came from the edge of the yard. I turned my head. My father stood there, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He wore no jacket, no tie, just a man stripped of his professional armor. "I wasn't sure if you would," I said, my voice steady. He nodded once, a sharp, abbreviated gesture. I wasn't sure either. He took a few tentative steps toward the porch, then stopped, hovering at the base of the stairs, not yet ready to bridge the final gap. We remained like that for a long moment, caught in a stalemate. The physical distance between us was barely 10 feet, but it felt like a familiar canyon we had both spent lifetimes staring across. "I didn't know about the trust," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I know." He looked up at the porch rafters, then back at me. "He never mentioned it." "Not once." "He didn't mention a lot of things," I replied. My father let out a long, slow exhale that seemed to deflate his chest. "That's not how I do things. I believe in transparency. In structure." "No," I said softly. "It's not." He stepped closer this time, placing one foot on the first wooden step, but he went no further. "I thought I understood him," he confessed, the admission sounding like a defeat. I didn't answer. I didn't want to fill the silence with platitudes. "I thought I understood you too," he added. That pulled my focus back to him. I looked at him, really looked at him. The certainty that usually defined his face had eroded. In its place was something raw and unpolished, something that looked dangerously like doubt. "I didn't think you needed anything," he said. There it was again. The same sentence from years ago, but the cadence had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow realization. "I didn't," I said. He frowned, his brow furrowing. "Then why does this feel like I missed the most important part of the story?" I held his gaze, refusing to blink. "Because you did." He didn't recoil. He didn't defend his legacy or argue his point. He just stood there, letting the weight of my words settle into the dirt beneath his feet. "I gave your brother what I thought mattered," he said after a while. "Capital. Influence. A head start." "I know. And you," he paused, searching for the right word. "You chose a path that had nothing to do with me." "Yes." He nodded slowly, processing. "I thought that meant you wanted to be separate from all of this. From the family. From the history." I looked around at the faded siding, the leaning railing, the wild field beyond the fence. "This was never really mine," I said. He looked confused, his hands gesturing toward the house. "But it was your home." "No," I corrected him gently. "It was your home. And his." The words weren't meant to be sharp, but they had the precision of a scalpel. My father finally climbed the remaining steps and stood on the porch, closing the distance between us. He didn't sit. He just stood beside my chair, looking out at the yard with me. "I didn't know how to measure what you were doing," he admitted. "I didn't have a metric for your life." "You weren't supposed to," I said. He turned his head slightly toward me. "Then what was I supposed to do?" I let the question hang in the air, thinking. It wasn't an easy answer. "Ask," I finally said. He looked away, his eyes tracing the line where the mowed grass met the chaotic growth of the open fields. "I thought giving you space was a form of respect," he whispered. "It can be," I replied. "But not when space becomes a substitute for understanding." He fell silent again, longer this time. The wind stirred the trees at the edge of the property. "I watched your brother build things I could see," he said. "Buildings. Portfolios. Tangible things. And I watched you leave." I nodded. "That's what it looked like from the outside." He let out a ragged breath. But I never asked where you were going. Or why. That was the moment. It wasn't a cinematic explosion. It was just a sudden, clear light in a dark room. I didn't need more things from you, I said after a silence. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. Then what did you need? I met his gaze, my expression open and honest. No more armor. To be seen. The words hovered between us, real and heavy. My father didn't offer a quick apology. He didn't try to fix it. He just nodded, once, slowly. I see you now, he said. I didn't respond. That kind of recognition doesn't require a thank you. It's a foundation, not a gift. It matters more what happens next. The wind swept through the yard again, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. My father looked around the property one last time, then turned back to me. What are you going to do with it? The trust? This place? I followed his gaze out toward the field, toward something much larger than this house, this town, or this moment. I'm going to use it, I said. For the first time since my boots hit the soil of this town, that answer felt entirely my own. The paperwork began the following Monday. It wasn't a grand production. It was a series of quiet rooms, steady pens, and the kind of meticulous work that builds a legacy without needing an audience. I stayed in town longer than I had intended. Not out of obligation, but because the work felt vital. The attorney's office was a relic, wood-paneled walls, faded certificates from the 60s, and a desk that looked like it had weathered decades of secrets. The attorney greeted me with a grip like iron. Ms. Whitaker, he said. I'm glad you're here. So am I. He gestured to a heavy leather chair. Let's talk about the mission your grandfather left behind. He didn't rush. He explained the architecture of the trust with a reverence that told me he had helped design it. It wasn't just a pile of money, it was a living, breathing strategy. Your grandfather began this nearly 10 years ago, he said, sliding a ledger toward me. I looked up surprised. That long ago? He was consistent, the attorney nodded. Small at first. Then he began moving assets regularly. He was building a fortress, brick by brick. I leaned back, the weight of the realization sinking in. 10 years. He had started this long before his health faltered, long before anyone else was thinking about end-of-life logistics. He had been quietly constructing this safety net while the rest of the family was busy arguing over the visible pieces of his estate. He never breathed a word of it, I said. The attorney offered a faint, knowing smile. That was the man. He wasn't interested in credit. He was interested in the result. He pushed a thick folder across the desk. Inside were investment summaries and legal charters, but it was the mission statement that caught my breath. This isn't a financial portfolio, the attorney said. It's a directive. I understand that. He studied me for a second, then nodded. I believe you do. There were conditions, of course. Not to restrict you, but to guide the fund's soul. It's designed to support veterans transitioning back. Specifically the ones who don't have a home to come back to. Housing, vocational training, emergency medical gaps. Nothing flashy. Just the practical floor someone needs so they don't fall through the cracks. He paused, tapping a finger on the final page. He was very clear about one thing, though. What? The fund is never to be used for PR. It is never to be performative. If the world knows about it, the world shouldn't know it came from a Whitaker. I almost laughed. That sounds exactly like him. The rest of the week was a blur of meetings, account managers, advisors, and a small, hand-picked board of directors who had all known my grandfather. No one treated me like a legacy hire. No one questioned my presence. They simply opened the doors and brought me in. On Wednesday, we visited one of the properties already under the trust's umbrella. It was a modest, refurbished apartment building on the outskirts of town. From the street, it looked ordinary. Inside, it was a sanctuary. A small group of veterans sat in the common room, the low hum of conversation filling the space. Coffee was brewing. Papers were spread out over a communal table. One man, perhaps in his 50s, looked up as we walked through. "Ma'am," he said, offering a sharp, instinctive nod. I nodded back. "Morning." I let the attorney talk to the coordinator while I just watched. I noticed the way they sat backs to the wall, eyes occasionally tracking the door. I recognized the subtle, vibrating tension of men and women trying to calibrate themselves to a world that moved at a different speed. I knew it because I carried it in my own marrow. One man stood up and approached me. He looked worn, his face etched with the lines of hard years, but his eyes were clear. "You new here?" he asked. "In a way," I said. He nodded, accepting that. "Place helps," he said simply. "How so?" He shrugged, looking around the room. "Gives you somewhere to land. Somewhere that doesn't ask you to explain why you're shaking. Asterisk somewhere to land. Asterisk, the phrase echoed in my head. That was it. Not a handout, not a cure, just a place to find your footing again. Later that afternoon, the attorney handed me the finalized documents for my signature. "This formally transfers operational control to you," he said. I felt the physical weight of the paper. "Are you ready for this, Ms. Whitaker?" I looked at the documents, then at the man who had guarded them for a decade. "I've been training for this my entire life," I said. I just didn't know it. The signing was quiet. No cameras, no witnesses other than a notary. Just a pen, a name, and a responsibility that had been waiting for me since the day I first left home. When it was over, I sat in the silence of the office for a long time. "You understand," the attorney said gently, "that this isn't a task you finish. It's a torch you carry." "I know." He stood and extended his hand. "Then I think your grandfather made the only choice that mattered." That evening, I returned to the family house. I didn't have to, but I felt a strange pull to be there. My father was in the living room. The television was off. No newspapers were scattered about. He was just sitting in his armchair, staring at the empty fireplace. "You're still in town?" he asked as I entered. "I am." He nodded, gestured toward the sofa. "How did the meetings go?" "Good," I said. Progress was made. He looked at me with an uncharacteristic intensity. "What exactly is it? What did he build?" I thought about how to bridge the gap between his world of spreadsheets and my grandfather's world of service. "It's support," I said, "for people who have been taught to never ask for it." He processed that, his jaw tightening slightly. "And you're in charge of it now? Truly?" "Yes." Another long silence stretched between us. "That's a staggering amount of responsibility," he said. "It is." He leaned back, studying me with a look I hadn't seen since I was a child, not judgment, but genuine curiosity. "Your grandfather always believed in things I couldn't quantify," he said quietly. "I thought I was the one building something solid. Something that would last." "You were," I said. He shook his head. "No. I built a mountain of stone." I think he was building a river. One that keeps moving even after the mountain crumbles. I felt the truth of that in my chest. "I think you're right." He looked at me and nodded, and for the first time in my adult life, the distance between us didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a bridge. The first real test didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened on a Thursday afternoon with a phone call. I was at the center, reviewing intake files, when my cell rang. "Unknown number." "Whitaker," I answered. There was a long pause. I could hear heavy breathing on the other end, the sound of someone fighting the urge to hang up. "Ma'am," a voice finally said. "My name is Daniel Ruiz." I was told this was the place to call. I leaned against the desk, my voice dropping to a calm, steady register. "Yes, Mr. Ruiz. How can I help you?" "I'm not sure," he said, his voice cracking. I was told you might be able to point me in the right direction." "I'm running out of directions." We talked for 15 minutes. He didn't tell me his life story. We aren't built to do that on the first try. But I heard the essentials. Army. Discharged 6 months ago. No family left in the state. A job offer in 3 weeks, but no place to sleep tonight. "I have a spot for a night or two," he said. "After that, I don't know." I looked out the window at the parking lot. "You're in town?" "Yes, ma'am." "Come to the center tomorrow morning." 0900 sharp, I said. A pause. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." I could hear the tension leave his voice in a jagged sigh. "Thank you." After the call, I didn't go back to the paperwork. I thought about Daniel Ruiz. This was the pulse of the machine my grandfather had built. It wasn't a concept or a tax shelter. It was a lifeline for a man who was 3 weeks away from making it, but didn't have the floor to stand on. The next morning, I was there at 0830. Old habits. Daniel arrived at 0857. He was wearing clean but faded clothes and boots that had seen too many miles. He stood by the door, hesitant, his shoulders tight. I walked over to meet him. "Mr. Ruiz." He nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "Yes, ma'am. Come on in. Let's get to work." We sat at a small table by the window. I didn't pull out a stack of forms. I just pulled out a chair. "Tell me what you need to get to that start date in 3 weeks," I said. He took a breath, his hands gripped together on the table. "Just a roof. And maybe a way to get to the site. It's a long walk." "We can do better than that," I said. In under an hour, we had him set up, a room in the transition wing, a meal card, and a small stipend for transportation. Nothing excessive. Just enough to bridge the gap. As he was leaving, he stopped at the door and turned back. "I appreciate this. More than I can say." "You don't owe us anything, Daniel," I said. "The bill was paid a long time ago." He shook his head slightly, a small, grateful smile touching his lips. "Still, it matters." I watched him walk across the lot. His shoulders were lower. His step was more certain. That was the moment it became real. Not the signatures at the lawyer's office, but the sight of a man walking a little lighter because someone had seen him. Later that day, my brother called. I hadn't heard from him since the funeral. "Hey," he said. "Hey." "I've been thinking," he said. "About the will. The trust. All of it." "I imagine you have." "I didn't realize how much he had put away," he said. "The scale of it is. It's a lot." He was a man of long-term plans. "Yeah," my brother sighed. "Look, I got the penthouse. I got the Tesla. I got the liquid assets." "I know. It's a lot," he repeated. "But it doesn't feel the way I thought it would. It feels like a lot of stuff. But it doesn't feel like a legacy." I didn't say anything. I wanted to see if he could find the words on his own. "What does yours feel like?" he asked. "It feels like work," I said. "The kind that matters." He was quiet for a long time. "He didn't choose against me, did he?" "No," I said. "He chose based on what he knew we were capable of. He gave you the things you wanted. He gave me the things he knew I could handle." There was a heavy silence on the line. "I don't know if I needed the penthouse," my brother admitted. "Maybe not," I said. "But maybe you can learn something from having it." He gave a dry, short laugh. "That sounds like something he would have said." "It does," I agreed. "So, this fund. What you're doing. It's different, isn't it?" "It is." "I drove by the building yesterday," he confessed. "I didn't go in. I just looked at it from the street." "And?" "I didn't understand it," he said. "But I could tell it was important. There was an energy to it." "You're welcome to come by," I said. "Truly." "Maybe I will," he said. "Eventually." When the call ended, I sat at the desk, my grandfather's desk. It was simple, functional, and worn. I opened a new file and labeled it with the trust's name. This wasn't about me. It was about a continuum. The first letter arrived 3 weeks later. It wasn't an official report or a legal notice. It was a piece of lined notebook paper, folded into a neat square. I knew the handwriting immediately. Asterisk, ma'am, I started the job on Monday. It's warehouse work, long hours, but it's steady. I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for the room, but for not making me feel like a charity case. That made the difference. Ruiz. I read it twice, then set it down gently. People rarely remember the exact amount you give them, but they never forget the dignity you leave them with. My grandfather had mastered that art. He never gave in a way that diminished the receiver. He gave in a way that reinforced them. By the end of the month, we had helped 7 more people. 7 more stories. 7 more places to land. The word was spreading, not through advertisements, but through the quiet, trusted networks of the veteran community. A local reporter eventually caught wind of it. She was young, her eyes bright with the hope of a human interest story. "I heard about the Whitaker Fund," she said. "Would you be willing to give me an interview? People should know what's happening here." I thought about it, then shook my head. "If you want to write a story, write about the people who are moving through here. Keep it about them, not the money behind it." She nodded, her expression shifting to one of respect. "I think I can do that." The article ran the following Sunday. It was a beautiful piece, focused on the resilience of the men and women who had found their footing at the center. My name was only mentioned once at the very end as the director. My father called an hour after the paper hit the doorsteps. "I saw the article," he said. "I figured you would. They used your name. Just once." He was quiet for a heartbeat. "I didn't realize the scope of what you were doing. Helping all those people. I didn't see the vision." "That's okay," I said. "It wasn't for everyone to see." "I showed it to some colleagues at the club," he said, and I could hear a strange tremor in his voice. "You did?" "Yes." I told them. I told them that was my daughter." The words hit me with more force than I expected. "That's the first time you've said it quite like that." "I know," he replied. "I should have said it a long time ago. I'm proud of you." The room didn't change. The light through the window stayed the same. But something inside me, a knot I had been carrying since I was 18 years old, finally unraveled. "Thank you, Dad." We stayed on the line for another minute, not talking, just sharing the space. When we hung up, the silence of the office felt complete. It felt like a mission accomplished. A few days later, my brother showed up at the center. He looked wildly out of place in his tailored suit, standing in the modest lobby. "I thought I'd finally come see it," he said, looking around. "I'm glad you did." He walked through the common areas, observing the veterans talking, the coordinators working. "This is it? This is the work?" "This is the heartbeat of it," I said. He nodded, stopping by the window. "I always thought success was about reaching the top of something, about being the highest person in the room. And now?" He watched a young woman in a faded fatigue jacket laughing with a counselor. "Now I think success is about building something that other people can stand on." He turned to me, his expression softer than I'd ever seen it. "I used to think you just left us behind." "I didn't leave," I said. "I just went somewhere you weren't looking." He let out a long breath. "Yeah, I see that now." We stood there together, not trying to fix the past or rewrite our history, just acknowledging the present. That evening, after the staff had gone home and the building was quiet, I sat at the desk one last time. I opened my grandfather's original letter. I looked at the final line, the ink faded but the message clear. Asterisk recognition is not always immediate, but purpose is eternal. I closed the folder, turned off the light, and walked out into the cool night air, finally at peace with the legacy I was born to protect. Part 1. Professional Translation. A faint, knowing smile touched my lips. "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. "It isn't." I folded the letter with deliberate care, following the original creases until it was small enough to be placed back into its rightful home. Then I stood back and looked around the room. I looked at the foundations that had been laid, the walls that had been raised, and the living, breathing work that continued to pulse within these four walls. Some people leave behind fortunes in cold, hard cash. Some leave behind titles or sprawling estates. They leave things that can be calculated by an accountant, measured by a surveyor, or divided by a lawyer. But others leave behind something far more potent: direction. They provide a compass, a map, a way forward through the dark. And in the end, perhaps that is the only inheritance that truly withstands the erosion of time. If this story brought someone to mind, someone who quietly shoulders burdens heavier than anyone ever realizes, take a moment for them. Reach out. Let them know you see them. Because sometimes, that simple recognition is all it takes to change the course of a life. Part 2. Rewrite and Creative Expansion. A ghost of a smile tugged at the corners of my mouth, a silent acknowledgement of the weight I now carried. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating weight of a burden, but rather the grounding weight of an anchor. "No," I murmured to the empty air, the words tasting like a promise. "It isn't over. Not by a long shot." I smoothed my thumb over the yellowed parchment one last time before folding it with the reverence one might accord a holy relic. I tucked it back into its hiding place, ensuring the edges were perfectly aligned. As I straightened up, I let my gaze sweep across the sanctuary of the study. I saw more than just bookshelves and oak furniture. I saw the physical manifestation of a vision. I saw the blueprints of a life well lived and the momentum of a mission that refused to go still. The world is obsessed with the tangible. Most people spend their lives clawing for things they can stack, count, and bequeath in a will: silver, stone, and soil. They leave behind assets that can be partitioned and spent until nothing remains but a name on a headstone. But there is a rarer, more profound kind of legacy. There are those who leave behind a trajectory. They don't just leave you a place to stand, they leave you a path to walk. They provide the moral iron and the spiritual light necessary to navigate a world that often feels aimless. That kind of inheritance doesn't sit in a bank account, it lives in the marrow of your bones. It is the only thing we take with us and the only thing that truly survives us. If, as you read these words, a face flickered in your mind, the face of someone who moves through the world with a quiet, unheralded strength, carrying 1,000 unseen worries for the sake of others, do not let the moment pass. Find them. Speak to them. Tell them, I see what you are doing and I see who you are. We often underestimate the power of being witnessed. Sometimes, knowing that your struggle is visible to even one other soul is the very thing that turns a weary ending into a brand new beginning.